Howdy guys, Tyler Bobo back with Jasmine again. We just did that video on the owner finance, and please look at all 4 videos we're doing. We did one talking about rent to own versus owner finance versus a lease option, and now we're on this video we're going to be diving into the rent to own option a little bit more. So as a refresher, the basics on the rent to own is it's kind of like a landlord-tenant relationship, but the agreement is a certain amount of the payment is going to go towards the purchase price. So if the rent's $1,500 a month, maybe a third of it, maybe half, maybe more or less is supposed to go towards the purchase. So you should have an agreement about what the purchase price is going to be, and that's the basics of what a rent to own is.
Are there now? So you're saying that the rent to own thing is it something between the landlord and the tenant, or the buyer and the seller?
Yeah, blurred lines there, and we'll get into that a little bit more.
Okay.
The main thing, the rent to own, is a landlord-tenant agreement. It becomes something else if it falls apart and lawyers get involved, which is a big reason why I do not recommend these, and we're going to go all through those. So there's pros and cons to rent to own for the buyer and the seller.
Okay.
Generally, I recommend that you don't use them, that you use either a lease option, which we'll talk about, has its own pros and cons, or an owner finance, which is better, but those don't always work. So if you were to do a rent to own, the pros to the seller is that basically it's very easy to find somebody interested in renting your property on a rent to own. Very easy. Too easy actually, because most of them shouldn't be are not really in the position. If they were, they might be looking at different options. So that's the main pro for the seller, is that it's super easy to find somebody who's interested as a tenant buyer.
I mean, are there cons for the seller then? Sounds like there might be quite a few.
Yeah, there are quite a few. So the cons for the seller is, to be very honest, these deals almost never close. This is a con for the buyer as well. It just gets really bad once everybody realizes that it's not going to close. So the cons are, it just usually doesn't work. The biggest problem when it doesn't work for the seller or for the landlord is a concept called equitable title. Right off the bat, I'm not an attorney, and there's a lot to know there, and it's going to vary from one state to the next. But basically, equitable title means that even if you don't literally own the property with an actual deed, you may have some sort of ownership interest that you could fight for in court. That's called equitable title. I do have equity in this property, and a lot of times that's a very legitimate claim. With a rent to own option, that can be a very legitimate claim. So the problem for a seller or a landlord, if they bring on a person as a rent to own tenant, and the person pays on it for say 10 years and then goes completely bonkers and quits paying, you might have a hard time evicting this person, because they can claim, potentially quite rightfully, that they do have equity in this property. So that's kind of a big, that's a very big con on a rent to own type of property. There are better ways to do it than rent to own, like a lease option, which we'll talk about later. But that is the biggest con for a seller, is they might find out sometimes years later that this buyer is not a good buyer. And if the document says that a certain amount of their payment has been going towards the purchase, they can have a pretty strong equitable title case. And when I say case, I mean attorneys, and they will end up with all the money. Nobody wins. So in that case. So yeah, those are the cons.
All right. So can you talk about the pros for the buyer / tenant in this case?
Yeah. So when a buyer or tenant is renting, normally you're renting, all you get is a stack of receipts. You don't get any tax advantages, you don't get any equity, you don't get any appreciation, nothing. If you're renting to own, you actually get the appreciation if the property goes up in value, but you're also building equity even if the property isn't going up in value for some reason. You're getting to build some sort of equity if a portion of your rent is going towards the purchase price. You're way better off than being a regular tenant.
Right on. Now, how does that tie in when you say they're building equity? It sounds similar to the equitable title. How does that tie in?
Yeah. So, earlier I mentioned, well, if the seller, if the buyer goes bonkers, then they can claim equitable title. Well, hopefully the buyer doesn't go bonkers, but say for the buyer, if the seller goes bonkers and he, says, well, I'm not going to sell it to you or something like that, or maybe he passes away or something, then you have a legitimate court case if your documents are in order and you can prove that part of the payment has been going towards the purchase, then you could claim equitable title and you could probably win that in court and you would have some portion of the property. Not all of the property though. So it gets muddled up there, but if your documents are right, then yes, you are building equity, and eventually if the transaction goes to fruition, you'll own it.
That's not a bad pro.
There's
definitely other options that are greater pros for other things.
It's actually the whole point.
Yeah.
And if everything happened and went to fruition, it would be a really great deal. It's just unfortunate. There's a million things that happen in life, I'm sure everybody can relate, that causes these things to not close.
Like that would start like going into the cons category, right?
Yeah. So on the con side is that, well, we just talked about it. If the buyer goes bonkers and you actually have to sue for your equitable title, anytime you get attorneys involved, they're going to end up with a big piece of it, and it can be very muddy if you don't have full title. Say you go halfway through the transaction, maybe the seller dies, now you're dealing with his heirs. So we'll get into that in a second, but another big con for the buyer is that when most people do this, they don't do a title search. We're not gonna dig real deep onto that aspect of the real estate transaction. But when you buy a property a more traditional route, you get a title search and title insurance. So basically, you know what you're buying. You know that there aren't liens on the property that aren't supposed to be there. You know that there's not a highway that's been platted through the middle of your property. You know that his cousin doesn't own 3% of it. You know that the guy who's selling it actually has the right to sell it. When most people do a rent to own, they don't do a title search. Now, a lot of times there might be small title issues that the seller doesn't even know about. Well, those small issues can become big issues over the years or decades, especially when people pass away. So if there's what's called a cloud on a title and then it doesn't get cleared up before somebody passes away, you're back in the courtroom you have to sue for quiet title, even when it's no fault of anybody's. The title situation is a big one. So I said, current title issues, there might currently be title issues to be sorted out, but later title issues, there might be nothing on the title that's a problem right now. But say the seller, during the term of this multi-year transaction, he gets in a car accident and somebody sues him, whether it's his fault or not. Now this house can get tied up in court and you're kind of stuck, right? So this guy's like, hey, I have equitable title. And the guy that was injured in the car accident is like, whoa, I've got some claim to this property too. So you're really, the attorneys will make all the money again. Not unjustly. I mean, they're gonna be working for their money, but there's only so much money in that house. So you end up in a very difficult situation. And then sometimes you might just get an unhonest seller, which is possible. You might get an unhonest buyer too. And then so the seller says a certain thing, maybe your documents aren't good, or maybe he just doesn't live up to the documents. The longer a transaction goes, if this is a multi-year transaction, the chances that somebody's gonna forget, change their mind, die, etc. What if the seller dies 3 years in and now the son shows up and the son's like, wait a minute, Dad said this was my property. He told me, I got a birthday card saying he's giving this to me like 12 years ago. Then the lawyers get involved again. All right, so in conclusion, obviously you can probably hear that I'm not a big fan of rent to owns for all those reasons. There are some pros. They do work out sometimes, but they usually don't. And there's a lot of legal problems, a lot of title issues, equitable title issues that they have. So in conclusion, if you're gonna do a rent to own transaction, it's not recommended, make sure you get a title search in the beginning. The title search in the beginning will tell you whether there's problems to start with. If there are, you can resolve them then. Also, you want really good documents written by an attorney if you can find one that'll touch this type of transaction. This is not a realtor type of transaction. No realtor wants to deal with this because it's such a fiasco. If you have really good legal rent-to-own documents written by an attorney, you can protect the title by recording those documents on the public record. Then if the guy gets in a car accident or somebody makes a claim later, they are past you chronologically to when you recorded your claim as the buyer. So another thing that's really going to help is if you keep it short term. So short term, make sure you get the title, make sure you've got legal docs, but you can also just avoid all this by doing an owner finance or a rent to own. Much safer and easier than a rent to own. But now you know what a rent to own is, you know what people are talking about. I've had a lot of people over the years come to me saying that they did this rent to own transaction. Maybe it was a handshake, maybe it was with a contract that they wrote themselves. And every single one of these, probably a couple dozen over my career, because I'm the creative finance guy, they come to me after the fact and they're like, look what's happened to me. These, you know, the buyer messed up or the landlord messed up and all this. And I look at the mess and I say, well, this isn't something a realtor can fix. At this point, you need an attorney, which I mentioned several times through the video. And generally, somebody is getting hosed. Somebody's losing a lot of money in this type of transaction. It's not that it's not a legitimate way to go, it's that there's almost always a better way to go. So anyways, as always, if you see any good investment opportunities, you need to buy or sell a house, please give us a call. We are really short on inventory right now, not just our team, but all across, our market. So give me a call. Thank you.